Welcome to Iran and the Soft War for Internet Dominance, presented by Claudio, Guarnieri, and Collin Anderson in, this is Lagoon K. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located in Bayside AB. The Black Hat Arsenal is on in the Palm Foyer on level 3. And of course, the Arsenal reception is at 5 p.m. If you haven't picked up your merchandise, today is your last chance to visit the Black Hat Swag and Bookstore. Visit the Kali Linux Lab in Mandalay Bay A. And finally, thank you for putting your phones on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore your phones when they're going off and heading to voicemail. And with that, please welcome Claudio and Collin.
Can you guys hear us fine? Yes? Good. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. Welcome to our talk. As said, Iran and the software for internet dominance. We have a lot of slides, so we'll try to go through fast enough in case we're too fast. At some point, you'll have the video recording, so you can go with slow motion with it. A bit of introduction. So, I'm Claudio. I'm a technologist at Amnesty International. I'm also a research fellow at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. And some of my projects include Cuckoo Sandbox, Viper, Malu.com. Is there a Cuckoo Sandbox user here? Raise your hands. Yeah, good.
I'm Collin Anderson. I come from a network systems research background. My nexus into this is that particularly the issues that are interesting from a network research field are issues of censorship, issues of surveillance, issues of control, which are uniquely manifested in Iran. So if you go back, I have about 7 years worth of research on looking at forms of censorship, mechanisms of censorship in Iran and its manifestations. And the intent really is to work with civil society organizations, particularly those that are policy facing, so that we can bring in technicalities, technical research into a public awareness and a public policy making process.
A little bit of due disclaimer. So me and Collin have been working on these topics for quite a while, actually for a few years. And this research is part actually of a larger body of work, which will come out in full in some weeks. So for clarity, the work that we've done in this presentation is completely independent from our respective affiliations, and same goes for personal opinions.
So, sort of as an abbreviated history, and one which is admittedly superficial, as a context, the internet started to really become publicly visible as a landscape for social and political change in Iran, kind of quintessentially in 2009. Now, there's this sort of false notion that this was the Twitter revolution, that this was being empowered through that particular social media platform. And there's a lot of pushback to say that, okay, that's a bit reductive. No one was really, tweeting in Persian during that time. But what was clear when we look at the way in which particular candidates, especially reformist candidates, were mobilizing at that time is that Facebook and Persian language social media platforms such as Balatarin had a fundamental role in mobilization for the election, for mobilization for protests that happened after there was a dispute over the election results. And so after 2009, you start to see very visibly what had been happening in the background, which was that the Persian language social media sphere was a very active way in which individuals could express their opinions online, which were repressed offline, or individuals in the diaspora that couldn't go back to Iran could still have a sort of a presence and connect with populations inside of the country. And so that leads to this contestation, this hyper-politicization of the internet inside of the country, which creates this notion, especially among the establishment, especially among hardline types, that the internet is essentially the grounds in which there's a soft war occurring. So we have this notion of soft power, which is the use of culture, the use of media in order to build up goodwill or have a foreign policy outcome. This is the escalation of it. This is not soft power, this is soft war. And so Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, I think, said it well at one point, which is, in a soft war, the enemy tries to make use of advanced cultural and communications tools to spread lies and rumors and take advantage of certain opportunities to create suspicion and discord amongst people. So the state reacts, right? Because this is the way in which anti-establishment, anti-revolutionary forces, counter-revolutionary forces are conducting themselves and laying siege to the state, so to speak. So you see this counter-reaction, right? In December 2009, you see, for example, the Iranian Cyber Army conducts a series of defacements, right? Doesn't say that they're state-led, but they are, for example, taking Quranic quotes, they're taking quotes from the supreme leader, they're targeting reformist sites. And so you have now the use of defacements as a mechanism in order to perpetuate the ideals of the establishment. Now, if you go on Zone H or anything like that, you'll quickly see that the top 5 of these leaderboards are often Iranian groups. And Iranians have been using SQL injections, using vulnerabilities in order to deface sites for often childish purposes or to create botnets for some time. But now you see it being used potentially in pursuit of state policies. Now, we know also that there was fairly interesting hacking occurring at that time. So we have the DigiNotar breach, right? You have the intrusion into the Dutch SSL-CA in order to issue certificates for Google, some Israeli intelligence services, American intelligence service, but also, again, Balaterian and other sorts of, kind of independent Persian language sites. So again, we see interesting hacking being used in order to conduct state surveillance. 300,000 people hit this man-in-the-middle attack. So that was a broad swath of the population. But the problem that I come from, having an interest in what's going on in this community, is that we don't really have a sense of what was occurring at that time beyond that, sort of under the radar. Was there malware? Was there phishing? What happened when dissidents were arrested and interrogated? We don't really have a lot of samples. We have the example of Mahdi, for example, but we know that things were occurring. So when we start to look at samples that we pull from VT and other places, the bait documents are very obviously intended to reach a politicized demographic. So for example, in one malware agent we find that upon execution, the user would see a Google Street View, I assume, map, which looks to be a protest route, right? This is a march down, I think, a march to Azad Square or something to that effect. And so clearly somebody was targeting, especially when you build up against some of the other bait documents. And we also see references in the Persian language blogosphere that people were getting targeted, they were getting spearphished, and this was being conducted in Persian. And these are people who had been forced out of the country. And so something was happening. And the intent of this project, and I should preface this by saying, what we're talking about today are some of the more recent events, some of the technical things that we want to disclose, but this is a start to a project rather than an end. Because 2013 happens. It's the first presidential election since the 2009 election. And while a lot of people thought it would be boring and fixed, in the month before the election, it just becomes dramatic. You have former presidents submitting their candidacy and then being disqualified. You had the people rallying around certain candidates. And we see the things that we expected before, right? We see, just like before, we see, for example, throttling of internet speeds. You see a reduction in internet access. You see defacements. But for the first time, we start to see malware. So we see, for example, satirical content being used as bait, targeting activists inside of the country, particularly, for example, politicians, being around the time of the election. And so when we know this is happening, and we know that this is common, Now, I think one other thing, the mandatory Gruck code is very useful. A lot of this is stuff that we know. The interesting thing about this, the thing that makes it complex is not necessarily that we have, they're dropping an O day on this sort of service, but that this is a thing that is affecting real people, and it is a state that is relatively isolated, trying to form its sort of policy and its mechanisms of conducting, let's say, cyber or computer network espionage operations and the like. So, we start to see a lot of malware actually. And it used to be in 2013, I'd get one a month and I would be super happy and like buy the person a beer. And now I'm sick of getting woken up with new samples. I like having new samples, I just would like to sleep sometimes. But again, this is interesting because you see this evolution over time. The first stuff we started to see is I think, very humorous. It's targeting people inside of the country, forging email headers, and claiming to be the CIA and saying, run this binary, run this exe. It'll securely and safely and anonymously let you report terrorists to the government, and you'll get a reward somehow while being anonymous. And this actually, this specific example ends up being linked with the Flying Kitten group, which was covered under Operation Saffron Rose. But we start to see this. And it continues and it shifts over time. And this is one of the patterns that you're going to see. Again, you see imitation of Facebook, fake Flash installations. These are things that we all, I think, pretty well know. But we see the implementation. So we'll cover about 4 different groups, I think 4 different campaigns, and we'll do so quickly. So to start off, one of the groups that we've been tracking has otherwise we think it's linked with a group that has been called Operation Cleaver, which was published by Silence in December 2014. What we want to talk about, for example, is what we think is their new malware agent based on strings, something that we're calling Gambar. So Gambar shows up in a novel way. A Spanish university site gets breached. A fake Department of Middle Eastern Studies website is created on their legitimate domain, and then using that and using the fact that SPF records will match the domain, start sending out pretty legitimate looking conference invitations to human rights activists in the diaspora. Again, something that you expect. Your Flash is out of date. Please wait before, please install before starting this Adobe Connect conference. This starts to go out massively to human rights activists.
So in the case of Gambar, the features that it provides are pretty much the ones that you would normally expect from these types of attacks. This is kind of condensed description of what it's generally capable of. It's capable of self-destructing, spawning a shell, taking screenshots of the desktop, shutting down the computer, rebooting it, so on, logging off the user, locking the computer, intercepting and setting the clipboard accordingly, even turning on and off the display for whatever reason, and certain features that are introduced inside the code base but not quite implemented yet include enable, disable the mouse and the keyboard, enable or disable the desktop, whatever that means, and eventually trigger a PSOD. So relatively common features that you find all over the place. The way that we've seen it distributed to different networks and different people that we have contacts with, and distributed in different forms. One of the first iterations of it was kind of implementing part of the features without actually having all of them right at the time, but still showing a certain level of attention to detail, at least compared to previous versions of malware that we believe are being associated with the same actor. And some of the tricks that they do, for example, they don't store any of the data that keylogger collects on disk unless the command and control is not available. It's all written in C#. It's pretty common across all the different groups that we see coming from Iran. The general default is custom developed backdoor, either in Delphi or C# or languages of this type. It's very rare actually to see off-the-shelf malware. We have a few examples of that, but generally speaking, that would be the exception. So in this case, you see like the implementation of it. It checks whether the endpoint is available or not. If it is available, it directly sends the buffer of the keylogger that is collected. If not, it stores it on disk and waits for the next iteration. At the next iteration, then, again, it checks whether the command control is available. If it is available, it uploads all the data that it collected, delete it from the disk so it doesn't leave any trace and leaves a little footprint of the infection. Does a certain manual sleep to bypass AV, which is a bit of a pretentious naming of this function, and then connects back again to check on the CNC. It has some neat things. As said, doesn't store anything on disk, is designed to be entirely modular, although we haven't seen copies of modules specifically dedicated to it quite yet. It uses a SOAP-based protocol for exfiltrating data just quite in the same way as TinyZbot was doing. TinyZbot was the backdoor that was associated in the report that was mentioned about Cleaver back a couple of years ago. And this is one of the reasons why we believe this might be the next iteration. The syntax, the structure, and the general protocol is almost identical. As said, the samples we obtain seems to be still quite under development. This is relatively recent. I think we saw it in the first quarter of this year, I think. And so it suggests that they're doing some improvement. They're kind of evolving their tactics and their skill sets and kind of improving along the way as they go. So general outcome of this is this might be the next iteration of Cleaver, which kind of fell out of the radar, at least for us, for quite a bit.
There's a couple of other things that we think are novel out of this. The first is that we happen to have lucked our way into what we think is, I think is probably a development or an early stage copy in the construction of Cleaver. And I think that this maybe perhaps speaks to the personalities of the people involved, but upon execution you have a debug statement if there's a debug file present. And what we see is a reference to Bismillah ir-Rahman, which is the first verse of nearly every chapter of the Quran. And so this either implies that the authors maybe thought that they needed the help of God in order to get this to work, or perhaps the religious background and the politics of those people involved. Another thing worth noting is across the Cleaver we see the use of impersonation often in order to start to create the pretextual conditions in order to conduct a spearfish. And you see really interesting patterns of people who are supposedly individuals in Iran that start to approach others connected with this group. And I think that this also speaks to one of the themes that we're trying to cover and we're trying to talk about today, which is you see these social media profiles, for example, Facebook profiles, and you see these publicly available likes, and they're really irreconcilable. So you have a person who says, I'm interested in world peace and human rights and development, and then their Facebook likes are an organization that has been written about hardline press and accused of being a front for US aid. You have a Facebook group that's advocating for violence against the Basij, which is a sort of conservative paramilitary organization connected with the IRGC. You see women's rights groups. And then you also see Draken International Aerospace Defense Firm and Barrett Ammunition Company. It's a surprising set of interests for an individual inside of Iran. And this is repeated. This is really common. So we see concurrent targeting using the same resources of both human rights activists as well as potentially, it seems, the defense industrial base. So just to sum up, we see active in sort of social engineering. We see a focus on that. We see the development of their own toolkit, which is rudimentary, but it's getting better over time. If Gambar is an evolution of TinyZbot, it does seem to be better programmed, more of a thought about its operations. So another group that we want to cover, which is newer, is a group that we're sort of tentatively calling SEMA based off of some document metadata. So SEMA comes in early February with much better social engineering skills, much better English than we had seen previously from any other group. And we see a really consistent use of real identities, creation of kind of compartmentalized emails for all of these attacks. But we see, for example, impersonation of Human Rights Watch in order to develop to deliver malware, which is essentially just .scrs posing as documents. Unfortunately for them, we don't see a lot of attention paid to their back-end infrastructure, and we start to see their patterns and broader targeting. And through their organization, we understand these patterns over time, which we'll get to in the next slide. But again, what's interesting is you have, for example, impersonation of the DHS, claiming to be notifications about green cards for people who often have issues with immigration status, targeting of that sort of vulnerability in order to deliver malware. So who was SEMA targeting? Well, within the infrastructure that we saw, the attacks that we were directly witnessing through receiving copies of the spear phishing attempts, SEMA seemed to be awfully interested in women's rights activists and human rights activists. And so across our samples, again, we can pull some of these samples from the back-end infrastructure, and we can start to see what they impact, to see what the types of demographics that they were speaking to. And we see, for example, people who might be interested in, for example, Iran pressing Afghan refugees into the Syrian conflict. And actually, in this case, what was interesting is that the individual who received this, a couple of hours before they received the email, had retweeted or tweeted something about this very issue. So you saw the individuals actively monitoring their targets and then responding very quickly to their perceived interests in order to touch on these things. Similarly, we saw a lot of debate was about feminist theory, was about issues of gender relations, was targeting women in particular. And so we see people who, also the people who are being targeted are people who are quite commonly sort of subject to the public ire of the state and state media, and were arrested before leaving the country, and these types of individuals.
So this actor doesn't, it's one of those exceptions where, firstly, it's one of those that hasn't fully developed an entire kit of their own. But it's also interesting because it doesn't, the expertise and the skills that they show in crafting their social engineering attack don't reflect in their development skills, quite at all, actually. So it's fair to say probably that SEMA, according to us at least, is one of among the best, I would say, in creating kind of that first entry in the attack, and creating well-crafted documents and believable context and so on. In terms of the actual technical capability, we've seen it being distributed around with a couple of different variations. Generally there is a first stage dropper, and we observed that they changed it over time. The first dropper that they used wasn't particularly well engineered, actually worked quite terribly, had a lot of logic flaws, and as a result of that, for example, once the victim would get attacked, the dropper will try to establish persistence by launching the cmd.exe and trying to have a registry entry created. Problem is that logic flows kicks in, cmd.exe gets spun indefinitely in an endless loop, and as user experience for the victim isn't that great. This goes on and on forever, pretty much. So then probably once they realized that their quality assurance wasn't that good, they switched over to a second dropper, which is much better engineered. In fact, quite surprisingly better engineered, to the point that perhaps it's been developed by some other people. The second dropper, which is the one that we've seen being used at a later stage and probably currently also, it's quite clean, established persistent through a task scheduler entry. It tries to fake the creation of the task and the creation of the file so that it doesn't look too suspicious, and it dates it a couple of years back. It suppresses errors and dialogue, so it makes sure that it's done quietly enough. The interesting aspect of it, again, is that it's one of those exceptions where they haven't developed a full kit of their own. They only developed the droppers, and instead, what the droppers would do then is instantiate a legitimate Windows process, and then does process allowing to replace the memory of it with a copy of kind of off-the-shelf available RAT, which is called luminosity link. We actually never, and I've never came across this particular RAT before, although we saw some mentions of this same tool being reported in previous reports, although there's not been any attribution being done to it, or there was no name of the actor being done to it. So at this point, SEMA, to us, is the only actor, at least for which we don't have previous history or previous documentation about their activities. Luminosity link, again, there's not much to say about it. General purpose RAT, collecting keylogs, collecting screenshots, chats, and so on and so forth. Not worthy to spend much time on. So summing up on this, they demonstrated excellent reconnaissance skills in order to identify what are the interests of the target and craft documents in a way that puts enough psychological pressure to actually fall for the attack. Better English than most groups that we've seen before. Very methodical in the way that they structured their campaigns. And in the public directory listing, they were classifying the different files and different attacks according to the different victims and targets they were going after. So quite methodical. Terrible OPSEC because they exposed everything to the public pretty much for us to find. Bad development skills and still quite successful. So to get into some of the more familiar actors that we know about or we believe to be linked to it, a lot has been made about Rocket Kitten. Rocket Kitten is definitely the most documented group. A number of people have witnessed and published on it, even including on some of the civil society aspects. We think that this is Rocket Kitten because Rocket Kitten, from the start when it was targeting, for example, European foreign policy institutions, was concurrently with the same malware, with the same phishing, with the same domains, with the same tactics, was targeting, for example, individuals working within diaspora, international media, and Persian language television services. So we see a consistency, and we see this set of actors kind of progressively over time. I think that we have a pretty decent visibility. So this is what we start to base our assertions of who this is on, is from this kind of longitudinal observation. But to sort of footnote, what we also see is that Iranian actors seem to change over time. Groups disband when they're outed, you have changing personalities, maybe people leave, and so there is some inconsistency which makes it difficult to track. So among the most recent attacks that we observed, and recent we speak of the last few months in fact, the ones targeting activists and dissidents and whatnot seem to resemble always kind of the same strategy. They would receive an email, they would receive an attachment to it, which would be an archive, and inside the archive they would find a number of link files, Windows link files, which is kind of bizarre because I've never seen this technique being used before. And not surprisingly enough, this is the structure of the link file. So inside the link file, what it actually does is executing a PowerShell process with a base64 encoded payload to it, and this payload would then spawn up a browser which would open a remote image that would be displayed, and in the back instantiate an infection process that we'll get into a minute. So very interesting technique. I wasn't aware even it was really possible, but it works quite well. And as we all know, there's no end to magic of PowerShell, really. At the same time, while they've distributed these types of attacks, we also saw other techniques being adopted by the same group. This is the more traditional one that distributes some documents with some macros in it. Try to lure the victim to enable the macros and execute them, and then would basically, again, instantiate the same infection process. And what this infection process would look like, again, would be launch a first stage executable, which would just gain persistence on the system through traditional means, registry keys and whatnot. And this executable would just then create a batch file where it would execute a PowerShell command again. This command would then, this PowerShell process would then inject into in its own threads certain portions of memory, which would later on, after a couple of stages, then connect to a remote server and then download DLL, which would be a copy of an interpreter, and then use that as a reverse shell. So we've been running this for a while and seeing what was interested in it. And surely enough, they connected to our VMs at some point. We walked off a little bit and we started hearing the sounds of the Windows 7 virtual machine rebooting, and we're like, what the hell is going on? And soon enough, they figured out that something was up with that, and they started deleting old files and rebooting it on and on and on, which was a good confirmation that this was pretty active. Second part of Rocket Kitten.
Second part of Rocket Kitten. Rocket Kitten has been, I think, very keen to adapt to circumstances inside of Iran. So, Iranians have been very active, like a lot of people, in the adoption of, for example, mobile chat applications. You had a series of iterations of different chat applications that were used, gained popularity, were maybe filtered, often filtered, and then people would move on to the next one. Early last year, I would say, the most popular service was Viber, but you had this sort of subtle degradation of the Viber service in a campaign in order to say that Viber was insecure, in part because its CEO was Israeli. And so people moved into Telegram en masse. The number is thought to be about like 20 million individuals, actually we know. 20 million individuals inside of Iran have Telegram accounts attached to phone numbers. That's 20 million people in a country of 80 million. That's 25% of the population, potentially. And even more through the diaspora that wanted to chat with those individuals. So this became a mechanism, again, because it was unblocked for sort of the free flow of information in order to access content, have communications that people thought were secure. And then we see a response. Similar to other things, we see a response from the state. We see reports of people's Telegram accounts being accessed upon arrest. We see people all of a sudden losing access to their accounts. And this starts to imply that there has been this response, this interest in what's going on, and a change or an adoption of new strategies in order to get access to those accounts. And we happen to know a fair amount about how Rocket Kitten operates. We have some visibility into their movements in these sorts of issues. And we start to see the creation of mechanisms in order to conduct spear phishing. We see the perfection of social engineering methods in order to coerce somebody or coax somebody into handing in their one-time or their password to log into their account. And we start to find the infrastructure. A peculiar event occurs around this time. Somebody gets spear phished, again from a link that looks like Rocket Kitten's, all of the other links over the past 2 years. And there's a host that was previously attached to it, and that host has open public directories. And in that open public directory, we start to find some interesting logs. And the logs start to look like a bunch of user IDs and phone numbers. In fact, it's about a little over 15 million user IDs. And I didn't catch it before it went down. It was probably ended up being 18 million user IDs and phone numbers, plus 98 phone numbers, clearly Iranian numbers. You start plugging them into Telegram, you see they all have Telegram accounts. You start to find that the PHP scripts that they're writing in order to empower this infrastructure, and it's very clearly querying Telegram and related to Telegram's data. You start using the API keys, and there are words like Godrat, empower, right? Shaftul, Pashmul. And so you have Persian language slang, Persian language words used in this infrastructure connected to Rocket Kitten. And this starts to provoke an interesting question. What's going on? And what we start to understand by parsing out these logs is essentially what had happened in just one host even. You had somebody registered a bunch of API keys, we think for the bot API, and just burned through them at as quick of a rate as possible, enumerating about, I think, 3 million telephone numbers, brute force per day, and just mapping out the entirety of who inside of the country has Telegram accounts. I think this is useful information. It's not a breach. It is an abuse. And it is certainly information that is useful for example, in the case of if you are trying to map out a social network structure after you've arrested somebody, if you want to start to understand who has what inside of the country. That is a very good intelligence operation.
So this matter has been publicized a bit in the last few days, and it got a lot of attention and Telegram issued a response to it. And we need to kind of dissipate some confusion around this because it's important to make it clear. Telegram did not get breached. Telegram's infrastructure did not get compromised. We have no knowledge of this happening. There is, however, there's been a bunch of media reports that have been suggesting this. This is not the case, and this allegation should be corrected because they're inaccurate. As Collin said, what we observed was a systematic abuse of the service, which is a completely different matter. So Telegram responded basically saying, yes, we've been aware of these SMS hijacking attacks. It's not new, which is true. There's been documentation of this for the last few months, at least since November the last year. And they also confirmed that they acknowledged that they were aware of this systematic crawling, basically, of Iranian phone numbers to identify Telegram users. One thing that we want to stress out is that this is, at least in our mind, nothing to brush off that easily. If you combine the fact that there's a state which has concerning records of human rights abuses and political suppression, if you combine that with the capability of performing SMS hijacking of that kind to take over a Telegram account with a systematic enumeration of the entire user base of a nation, that's a concerning thing. And particularly if the service provider is aware that these attacks have been going on for a while, the fact that it's being extended to the point where they wanted to identify the entirety of the Telegram users inside the country should be something of an alert that it's critical enough to notify the users, and this did not happen, which we believe is a problem. However, summing up on Rocket, there are diverse activities which makes it a very interesting actor to follow. They adopt very interesting tricks. They demonstrate to be very experienced attackers. They do quite consistently make use of publicly or semi-publicly or commercially available penetration testing tools. And recently, again, in these last few months, we observed them just making use of Metasploit quite effectively. In the past, there's been reports of them using a pirated copy of Core Impact, for example. They're very active as we speak. And at least for us, it's one of the most concerning groups because of these previous points all combined.
So, congratulations to our dear friends at Palo Alto for publishing before we did, but also finding, I think, a pretty good name for this group. So, one of the groups that we also started to see, actually as early as 2013, was the Infy group. And so, included in that set of malware that we started to see reference the election in the lead up to the 2013 election, we started to see emails that were sort of kind of poorly crafted, vaguely worded in references to alliances and statements, kind of implying that there was a relationship with the current Iranian political discourse, but not necessarily anything that was an extremely elaborate targeting or social engineering attempt. In fact, we start to find that Infy goes back even further. The blog post that I referenced from 2011 targeting the blogger seems to also be the Infy group. Actually, Infy goes even further back, and we find it as early as July 2010. And this starts to bear out some of the other things that we start to come across that is interesting and kind of, I think, shapes the way that Iran's activities online or Iranian intrusion attempts, campaigns are seen. Because the earliest that we can see out of Infy is an incident in which it appears that a blog was breached, a little iframe was inserted into the blog in order to serve malware. It looked like a stat counter, and the organization that ran the blog became aware of it, notified their participants or their visitors that there's something going on, there's weird emails being sent, don't go to this blog anymore. Now, what's interesting about this, I think uniquely, is that this is an organization called Jundala. This is a Baluchi separatist organization that is engaged in violence against civilians and against border patrol agents over the past decade. This is an organization that is listed as a terrorist organization not only in Iran, but in the United States and Europe as well. And so what you see is Iran is actually not just going after human rights activists or the military industrial firms, but also they're going at these targets that we kind of have allowed space for, terrorist organizations. It starts to sound pretty familiar. And so this goes forward. We see these watering hole attacks go up to 2015. And we also see actually in the lead up again to the February 2016 Majlis election, which again had a remarkable amount of mobilization, we see improvements. We see, for example, when a prominent establishment figure gets disqualified, there's an immediate response. There's a malware that goes out in that respect. And so Infy across time starts to care about the message that they said and even bothering to include a body.
So there's an interesting consideration to be made, not just on Infy, but also of all the other groups that we've seen so far, is that in none of the cases that we have come across in this particular set, exploits have actually been used. Never happened. They've always been using different social engineering tricks and different techniques of different types, and Infy is no different. So in this case, the general modus operandi of the group is crafting, again, malicious documents that would not leverage specific vulnerability in Office, but they would rather embed OLI packages inside the slides, most cases being PowerPoint presentations, and then configure them as such that at the opening of the slide deck, an animation would trigger that would then execute the OLI package. I'm still baffled a bit by the idea that there's animation to execute binaries in PowerPoint. I don't really fully understand the legitimate use of this, but it's quite interesting. And it's also a bit telling in the sense that by embedding these OLI packages, these executables fundamentally, the usernames, the full path of the original file is embedded in the documents, which reveal basically the usernames of the accounts of the attackers that have crafted the documents. And in all these cases, they're basically really just shared references. Interestingly, at some point during the process of us kind of monitoring this group, which we've been looking for quite a while actually, the attackers starting encountering some operational troubles. Some of their CNC domains started getting blacklisted by antiviruses and security products, and it's problematic for the success of their operations. And so as a first reaction to this, we see them actually starting to contact all these different security vendors. So they've started contacting McAfee and Sophos on their forums and going out and say, hey, you did a mistake. Our domains are totally legitimate. You should definitely remove them for your blacklists. They don't fly very high.
They got a couple.
They did a couple, actually. There was a couple of that did, in fact, remove the domains from the blacklist, which is quite interesting. But it's a hilarious attempt, I would feel, of them trying to take back their domains in a usable form. However, not being entirely successful, they started implementing a solution to this. The solution was updating the malware in a way that it would implement a domain generation algorithm that would trigger regardless, basically, with a new domain pretty much every day. The algorithm is kind of bizarre, so it doesn't generate a different domain every day. It uses a rotating pool of fixed domains, and the format would be that box40xx.net. So the first mistake is that, again, they use a fixed pool. The second mistake is that the DGA domains, which normally would be triggered, would be connected to if the primary CNC is not responding, they are actually triggered and they're connecting back to them regardless. So even if the primary CNC is up, the malware would connect to the primary CNC and then connect to the DGA too. Unfortunately for them, and when we realized this, we saw that only one of these domains were actually previously registered. So we took pretty much all of them, almost all of them, and started syncalling the entire thing since December 2015. Interestingly enough, they didn't notice for 6 months. We set up a very professional syncall camouflage. So if you go to the DG domains that we were syncalling, you would see these kind of domain squatting pages with, if you want to buy this domain, contact us at this address. So by syncalling all of these DGA domains, then at some point, almost immediately, we start seeing all of the infected computers beaconing back to us, and there's a lot of it. In beaconing back to us, it gives kind of enough details in some cases to give us an idea of who the targets are. But it's a large amount. We've seen between 200 and 300 at a specific point, and quite interestingly distributed.
So quite predictably, despite the global reach, and there is an interest in not just Iranians, but the vast majority, or plurality, are Iranians inside of the country. But then when we start to actually look at the other indicators that we have, we see that even those outside of the country, for example, in Sweden and the United States, are often Iranians, or have a Persian background, or have a Kurdish background, so become stability issues. So Infy is almost certainly responsive to the political environment. You see an increase of infections from Infy in the lead up to the February 26th, 2016 election. You see mass pushes as quickly as possible into malware.
So one interesting thing that we observed at some point, quite surprisingly, is that we noticed that the developers of the malware would kind of almost systematically every couple of months develop an update to it, change certain aspects, certain feature, and perhaps defeat detection. Between like 1 and 2 weeks prior to the distribution to all the different victims, they would actually test the new version of the malware, and by doing so, they were also beaconing back to us. And so by running the DGA sinkholes, then at some point, in different occasions, we started seeing the computers of the developers connecting back to us and exposing certain details of it. And so we kind of reconstructed it back, and across all the different versions updates, we started seeing, the host names and the IP addresses were quite consistent, and we believe this to actually be the developers of Infy. They didn't notice this again. This happened over the course of 5-6 months, starting in January when we saw the first update to it, and then close to the end of April and beginning of May, again checking back to us. Given that geolocating things in Iran is quite hard, however, it's quite interesting to see that normally they would always connect from the same region inside the country. There's our third mistake, and speeding up a little, is that at some point we also noticed that when they were issuing these updates, the update mechanism was simply just having this primary CNC issuing a 302 HTTP redirect to a certain URL pointing to a binary. The malware would just download it and execute it. There's no verification of the binary, there's no signing, nothing whatsoever. And by testing in the lab, then we also noticed that the DGA could also issue updates. So not only do they expose the DGA and the entire victim base, but also perhaps expose the entire victim base to be compromised again. And we'll leave it at that.
So the quick run through is the release of Palo Alto's report sets off a struggle between sinkhole operators and the actors. A couple of notable things happen. You see updates being pushed down, but the most remarkable for our purposes, I think, is actually one of the things. There's a third actor that tries to sinkhole these domains for reasons that we don't know, or that starts to play into the struggle, and that is the Iranian government themselves. So the CNC domains that appear in Palo Alto's report and that we had been tracking actually get filtered inside of the country. That exposes two potential hypotheses. One is that they wanted to cover their tracks, or two, that they wanted to end this. We think that Infy is still going. On the basis of some sinkholing of other infrastructure, we see latent infections that are coming from places that we don't know. They seem to be potentially a different set than ones that we were observing. So there's a struggle still to regain access to this network. And given the investments that they had made in the development, it seems unlikely that this is actually going to end as a campaign. So given that we have 1 minute left, the intent of this overall is to start to expose the information historically about these things because it has significance to human beings. There are disparate groups, they have a mentality, there's a rationality of a state, and we have this remarkable ability to start to actually kind of qualitatively and quantitatively demonstrate what the interests of potentially an intelligence apparatus are, or at least actors that are compromising dissidents' accounts. So this is an ongoing project in order to basically start to put down everything that we know in capacities like this. The next publication will be through the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Eventually, probably like 2 months or so, we'll be collecting harm stories. We'll be collecting, putting out more IOCs. There's not as many IOCs as we'd like to in this report, but we are running a site now in just a GitHub site in order to put them out as quickly as we possibly can. If you have questions, please reach out to us. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for the contributions of a number of individuals. Morgan, Snor, Nima Fatemi. Domain Tools provided some really great access. We appreciate that. And we want to make this an open umbrella, we welcome other people's contributions, their thoughts, their criticisms even. We're pretty accessible. Claudio.
So before leaving you all to move to the next talk, we just wanted to make a little bit of a reflection. What the work that me and Collin have been doing have been focusing almost entirely on at-risk communities, activists, and political dissidents, and so on. So attacks that have a political significance. In analyzing these things, there's always kind of overlaps and crossovers with the industry. So you guys are kind of representatives of the InfoSec industry, have a lot of access to data and information, and we're all kind of fighting the same fights. In many cases, the actors that we observe are the same actors that you observe. At the same time, you have access to data. We don't quite as much. However, we have access to human networks and people on the ground through our different jobs and personal experiences. And we have the means to stop these attacks. But it's really hard for us to actually come across them in the first place. So what we would like to invite you all to kind of start considering is there is a role in this industry, in this community, to contribute more systematically and more openly towards resolving these issues, which are not just technical issues for corporates. It's also human and political issues of people that are risking their lives in these respective countries. So in that sense, we're open to talk, and we invite you all to if you can, and if you have the ability to do so, and if you come across cases that are relevant for the human rights community, to get in contact with us. If you have tips, samples, whatever you want to share, please do. Take a picture of this slide if you want to. And with that, we'll leave you. And thank you all for coming, and hope you appreciated the talk. And